Hello to everyone watching, and thank you for tuning into this Prolific North webinar in partnership with Metricomm. Today, you'll hear from our panel on the new approaches to PR measurement and evaluation, which make the most of relatively new forms of data in the sector and technology to make it make sense. You might be a PR professional looking to better prove how well your campaigns are doing, or a brand looking for insights to track the effectiveness of output, but there's something here for everybody today. We'll meet our panel in just a moment, but skipping ahead to the end of today's webinar, we'll be taking questions from you, the viewers. So if you'd like to submit a question to our panel, you can use the Q&A function, which you should be able to see in Zoom, and we'll get to those questions at around 10:45 after our discussion. Let's meet today's panel. If you'd like to introduce yourselves and tell us what you do, starting with Marianne.
Hello, so I'm Marianne. I'm Director of Research and Analytics at PR agency Citypress. I'm also a board director at AMEC. So AMEC are the Association for Measurement and Evaluation of Comms. They're essentially the global body that sort of governs best practice when it comes to comms measurement. So I'm talking a little bit today with both hats on.
Great stuff, Karen.
Thanks, Alistair. I'm Karen Williams. I'm Client Director at Metricomm. We're an agency that specialises in using big data to help both in-house and PR agency teams to prove the effectiveness and get more insights around the way their PR is working.
Great stuff. Thank you both for joining us today. So let's start with the basics, set the scene first for anyone who's watching that's maybe not in the PR industry. A question for both of you. What are the historical processes for PR measurement and evaluation? Can you give me a brief overview of how things have been done?
Brief history of time.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to show my age here. So when I started in PR, there was pretty much only one way that everybody measured the value, and that was AVs or EAVs, so advertising equivalent values. And basically what we would do is we'd take a ruler and we would literally measure the size of the coverage that we got in the newspaper and work out how much that would have cost to get as advertising. And it was deeply flawed, but everybody did it. So it worked because everybody was doing the same thing. So you had really good comparisons. And then the internet came along and basically screwed up the entire system for everybody, because you can't measure a screen in the same way you can measure a newspaper. And that's not how online advertising is sold. So it just made no sense anymore. And we went into this sort of period where we had a bit of a wild west of measurement, and everybody was making up their own thing and everybody was doing it a little bit differently. And then beyond that, now we're sort of at a stage where actually there are some really clear guidelines, and as an industry, PR has got a really clear process in place, but there are still pockets of things sort of being done in different ways. So I guess where we're heading to is a more consistent way of measuring, in a way that is more scientific and more data-led, as Karen says. So with my AMEC hat on, AMEC have a measurement framework, and they basically say you should be measuring three things: outputs, outtakes, and outcomes. So outputs would be all the basic PR metrics that everybody's used to measuring. So, you know, how much coverage did you get? How many social posts? What was the reach of that? What was your key message penetration like? How many people came to your events? All those sort of basic numbers metrics that as a comms team or as a PR team, you would probably own. Outtakes is the audience's reaction to that content that you've got out there in the world. So did you see the content and think, oh, great, like all that content about Coca-Cola, I really fancy a Coke now? Or, you know, looking at your likes and shares and views and comments, you know, have the audience taken something from it? Doesn't matter what they think about it, but did they react to it? Because that suggests that your content is resonating. And then the third aspect that we're meant to measuring, or that we should be measuring, is outcomes. So what happened? What did you change behavior as a result of your communications? So did you get up off the sofa and get a Coke out of the fridge? Did you buy one on the way home? And that metric is always linked back to your objectives. So if your objective is to grow sales, then you're going to be tracking sales there. If it's about awareness or perception, you're going to be asking people what they think and how they feel about your brand or your business. So in an ideal world, that's how PR should be measured, is outputs, outtakes, and outcomes.
Thanks, Marianne. I mean, I think we can go probably even a little bit further back in time. As Metricomm, our data director, Mark Westerby, founded a company called Metricomm back in the 90s, I think. And They're now part of Cision, obviously the world's largest media evaluation company. But that was back in a time where people used to literally sit in a big shed and with a pair of scissors, if you remember, cut round those press clippings that you were just talking about.
That was my first job. The press clippings came in and I had to scan them in.
That's soul destroying. Yeah, so they used to sit with a checklist and actually look at the key messages and tick off whether they'd been delivered and so on and so forth. And like Marianne says, the world has changed, thank goodness, a huge amount since that. I think there are still two aspects of PR measurement that Marianne was outlining that the industry is struggling a little bit with. The first thing is the reliance on vanity metrics. And often this is to do with volume. It's because people like to report big numbers. In-house execs like to get big numbers about the volume of coverage, the number of clippings that they've achieved. They're counting, just raw counting, things like impressions or reach. My issue with this is, I don't know whether anybody listening to the webinar is a sort of philosophy fan, but I call this the Leibniz approach to media measurement. It's the best of all possible worlds. So Leibniz said the world that we live in is the best of all possible worlds. So you take the best of everything. The problem with vanity metrics is that you're always trying to sort of maximize your reporting to reflect these big numbers. But what it doesn't do is really, I think, address the third pillar of what Marianne was explaining and getting to the bottom of the impact of PR and communications. And that means the impact on the audience. And, you know, it's how do we actually know when somebody has reacted or responded to a piece of PR coverage? How do we really know whether the audience is engaging or not? And the second thing is that for me, it's still not closely enough tied to what I would call genuine business outcomes. And I think for the PR industry, there's always been a kind of excuse, well, you know, our role is to generate awareness and visibility, and it's a long-term game. Well, that's partly true. Awareness is really important, and so is visibility. And of course, your long-term reputation is vital to any brand or organization. However, you know, fundamentally, the reason why organizations need awareness and need reputation is so they can make sales. You know, the ultimate impact, really, if we can demonstrate it, has to be on commercial outcomes, you know, whether you're a charity or, you know, any kind of commercial organization of any size. You want to know whether your PR is moving the needle on sales and an actual audience response.
Obviously, we'll come to some of those improvements and some of the ways that you look at metrics later, Karen. But is that how the industry is measuring itself at the moment, is through a very commercial sales point of view? I
don't like to disagree, but I'd slightly disagree that it all comes back to sales. I think I was looking at some academic research actually only earlier this morning around the importance of a brand demonstrating its social value beyond its, or a reason for being beyond sales, and how the brands that do that best, they do outperform, but that you've got to, and I think they outperform in terms of sales. So it is about coming back to sales, but I think if comms is just a sales driving tool, then I think we're missing some of the great nuances of comms and some of the great benefits of that sort of more subliminal influence, I guess, that you get through PR. So I think it obviously as an end goal, it does come back to sales, but I'm very cautious about always measuring just sales. I think you're right to ask the question, Alistair, because I think it's at the moment, it's a really mixed bag. I think a lot of businesses and a lot of comms programs are measured just on those outputs metrics, which I think Karen referred to as vanity metrics, which is sort of quite widely used as a term within the industry. You know, the metrics, just the stuff that you can control. And that's one of the reasons that they're the metrics that people measure, is because they're the metrics that they've got access to and are easiest to get. I think the really sort of advanced brands and perhaps more developed brands are looking at measuring business impact, and it's not always sales based, but I don't think that we should be shy about sometimes measuring awareness or perception or salience or those things, as long as that's what the comms program was set up to do. But I do take your point, Karen, that sometimes maybe the objectives set for the comms campaign and what the campaign is trying to do maybe isn't the right thing. Sometimes the objective isn't right. And that's why I think the biggest gap is measurement not being used enough for planning and actually being used as that pat on the back at the end of the month, this sort of report for filing, an insurance policy should anybody ask, rather than a tool that can actually be proactively used to improve and refine and make things better.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, Marianne, and I'm glad you've raised that, because we've had a number of conversations over recent months with brands where we've done some analysis of the way they're engaging audiences and their impacts on things like Google search, which is a great proxy for sales. And at the end of the meeting, we've been able to say to them, you're doing a great job. At the moment, your PR is engaging the audience. You're using a certain number of media titles very effectively. The problem is, if you're not monitoring and tracking those things on a regular basis, then you miss it when things start to go off track. And you can say, well, I'm doing a great job. I'm getting the volume. I'm getting the clippings in the right publications. But you really need to have those metrics that show you, that give you the advance warning of the undercurrents that are likely to maybe change things 3, 6 or 12 months down the track. And that's what a lot of brands have not got their finger on the pulse of at the moment.
So I suppose what we're saying there is we're looking, I suppose, give us a bit of an idea, I guess, about how PR is assessed, because it sounds to me like the assessment of the data has been carried out after the campaign's over. Is that a result of necessity, or is that just the way things are done?
I think it's probably historic. I don't know about you, Karen. I think, reports have always been done at the end of the month, and that's just how they've been done. And, you do your monthly report, your end of campaign report. And I think, it's right to do that. It's right to assess what's happened once it's happened, so that you can then use that to inform future programs. But I think where it's falling down is that it isn't being used to inform future programs, that it's just then going into a black hole. Oh, good, that's all done. Here's our report, boxed off, move on to the next thing, rather than those learnings really being taken forward into future programs and being used to sort of incrementally improve everything.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree. I think it is a historical thing. It might also be a budget consideration. And so often the budget that organizations give their PR agencies or their PR teams for evaluation is so small that they can't really afford even the most basic pre-campaign or mid-campaign evaluation. We are increasingly finding, though, that people do ask us for data that can be used for benchmarking before they start planning their campaigns, so that they can think very carefully about how they want to approach the campaign to get the best ROI from the budget that they have to spend on activation.
And looking at the wider PR process, for those without someone like a Karen or a Marianne, typically who's interpreting the data? What sources are they using? Is it calculations? Is it an Excel sheet? Is it other tools? A question for both of you, I suppose.
I mean, I don't know about you, Karen. The clients that I see, or anecdotally what I'm seeing when I'm talking to people, is generally a quite heavy reliance on media monitoring companies who are brilliant and do a great job and provide really interesting data. But the challenge is that often they're sort of external to your business, so they don't understand the comms strategy and why things were done the way they were done. So it can be quite difficult, I think, for them in isolation, unless you've got a really good, close working relationship and you are keeping them abreast of what's changing in your brief. It's quite difficult for an external media monitoring company to come in and say, oh, I've seen all this stuff and I think you should make these tweaks. Generally, what you see is they say, this went up this month, this went down this month, this changed this way. And you're left to interpret that yourself. I think, as the comms manager, you'd be left to interpret that yourself. And I think the challenge with that is that actually comms managers have two issues. They don't have enough time to spend looking at the data and interpreting that and taking it on, but also often they're not close enough to the data to really understand what it's showing them and know how to then overlay that with other stuff. And I think the danger is that you look at that media monitoring data in isolation And maybe you get a report from your agency and you get a report from your monitoring company and you get some sort of internal report, and you look at them all in isolation, and the real magic happens when you start to put all of that data together. But that takes time and a little bit of understanding, I think, on what you're looking at. But I don't think it's a barrier. I think all comms professionals could do it. I don't think you don't have to be. I'm an ex-PR person turned analytics, so you don't have to necessarily have a maths degree to be able to do some of this stuff, but you do need the time and you need to get to know your data to be able to do it well.
I would agree with that, and I think some people are scared of the maths that underlies a really robust evaluation. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're doing and that I'm going to talk about later is based on some fairly complicated statistics. But actually, that's what we're here for. We're here to help our clients with the interpretation and the analysis, to help them draw out the insights and to say, actually, based on what we've discovered, these are the things that you can and should be doing to make a difference. I'd like to come back to something a bit more fundamental, though, Alistair, if I may, and that is not sort of who's interpreting the data, but what data are they interpreting? And I think a lot of organizations are still trying to interpret the wrong data. And that sort of comes from this tendency on the part of the industry, again, from big numbers, to want to look at all of the clippings and all of the coverage. And actually, from all of the projects that we've worked on over the last few years, what we're seeing time and time again is that actually a lot of that coverage is completely irrelevant because it's not engaging the audience. It's out there, but it's not having an impact on anybody at all. So we work on the 80-20 rule. And this has been sort of demonstrated time and time again with our client data, that 80% of the results come from just 20% of the outputs of the media coverage that you obtain. So if you get your report from your clippings agency and you're looking at findings and insights that are drawn from all of it, then actually what you're looking at is quite misleading. So the way I think about it is that if you've got a whole box full of media clippings, only 20% of those are actually going to be having an impact and changing and driving that behavior. But you've got to be able to sift through the box and find the 20% that is relevant. And I think that is the biggest problem with interpretation. We have to start with the right data.
And I suppose compared to, if I've got this right, compared to modern digital marketing, when you're looking at the conversion of PR to sales, Karen, and this is kind of the core point really, particularly in print and broadcast, often happens in the mind of the consumer in a way that it doesn't through a digital ad, which you can track from beginning to end. So there's seemingly no tracking there. Is that still a fair assessment? Is that kind of what you're talking about here, about the right calculations, the right data to kind of prove that sales process, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm not talking about is tracking individual consumer behavior. And obviously the marketing platforms and the digital platforms that are used nowadays have a lot of inbuilt metrics, and those are very powerful for organizations and for their agencies. What I think is not something that we should be doing as a PR industry is putting cookies on people's individual computers and working out which websites they're visiting and which publications. And there are some firms in the industry that are looking at that as an approach. There are two problems with that, though, Alistair. The first one is that obviously it could be seen as a great infringement of privacy. And I think certainly in Europe, there might be some issues with that. The second thing is that so many consumers nowadays, and I know I do, I have it implemented on my own laptop, I have software to stop people tracking where I'm going and seeing what I'm looking at. So you have to have other ways, and we have other ways of working out what the audience is who is actually engaging with content without actually being able to put your name on that or Marianne's name on that and saying that was Marianne looking at that piece of media coverage.
That's blessed relief for me. Goodness knows what I've been searching.
And is it fair to say, I suppose, that the notion that the effectiveness of PR isn't measurable or as measurable, or that it's hard to track, again, compared to digital marketing, where there's very clear analytics, is that true? Is it fair? Again, is it the case that you've got, like you say, this comes from a background of having to measure clippings with a ruler, so of course it's going to take a bit more time.
Yeah, I think I mean, they're definitely probably, I'm asked that question every single time I do one of these sessions, so I'm going to say that's still a perception out there. I think there's maybe two reasons that comes up all the time. Is one, that PR is not very linear, as I think you touched on before. So, my mum could read an article about buying, I don't know what, tents in January, but she doesn't need a tent in January. When she goes to buy a tent in June, she might look at Aldi's tents because they've got, great quality tents, or she knows that they're, good quality for the price or whatever it is. But she won't necessarily be like, oh, I'm doing this because I read that in the Telegraph in January. And you wouldn't get that either from, any sort of Google search analysis or anything like that. So it's not completely linear, but you can track, for example, how my mum's perception, how well did that initial piece of coverage land? Did it trigger a lot of search at that point? Did it trigger an increase in word of mouth discussion? Did it gather lots of comments? And have we seen a general perception uplift in terms of quality, and how long does that tail last? So you can start to link PR back to some of the behavior changes, but it's not completely linear. And the second reason that I think that PR has that reputation is that there is no silver bullet. It is unfortunately different for each campaign, because it depends on what your objectives are, it depends on what your tactics are, it depends on where that brand is at in its journey and what it's trying to achieve. So it's not like the ruler thing. You can't take it off the shelf and be like, we'll just use a ruler, everybody use a ruler, job done. It's different for each one, and that makes it feel less tangible, I think, somehow. But having said that, advertising is probably our closest marketing buddy in terms of how it works, and nobody goes around saying advertising's not measurable. So it is something that we need to get away from, I think.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Anything digital and the rest of the marketing mix is very much held to account. And I think it's a real pity that PR people are not necessarily put under that pressure to demonstrate that when they're spending the company's money, they are actually getting a return. And, I would argue very strongly that, we do have tools. We have some very good tools nowadays to prove that PR is actually making a contribution. And if you were to put it into an econometric model, and you could compare it, which you can using our data, to things like advertising or to, paid social and things like that, then I think a lot of PR people would be very pleasantly surprised, actually, to see that they're making a much better contribution to business results than they might think they are if they could only be bothered to gather that data. And, I think, again, it's about knowing about the tools that are out there. And, there are things that we can do today that we couldn't have done 2 or 5 or 10 years ago. It's constantly evolving. And I think we have to keep educating the industry about the ways in which it is possible. But I would always completely disagree with anybody who says it can't be done.
I'd echo that. We did an econometric analysis for a client not that long ago, and PR came out as the best marketing channel of all of their marketing channels in terms of delivering a return on investment for sales. So there definitely is hard proof out there.
I wonder as well, just looking at it, obviously you said, you mentioned there that the teams can have access to that data if they need it. From the client's point of view as well, how much of that perception of PR is there with the clients as well? Are they demanding it and not getting it, or do they also accept this myth about PR that we know it works, we don't know how, but we can't afford not to do it?
No, it's really interesting actually in terms of talking about client demand for measurement. So I would say it's in every pitch that we ask. It's a core ask of every pitch that we go to. So having really rubbish measurement or not having a good measurement function would definitely be a pitch loser. It's an absolute deal breaker for clients. But what's really interesting is once you've won that account, or even in the discussion stage, having amazing measurement is not, it's not the campaign winner either. It's all about creativity and execution, but they need to know that you can deliver that. And I think the reason for that is this historic reliance on reporting being an end of the, a checkbox at the end. I think the clients who are willing to spend on measurement and are really invested in it are the ones who can see it constantly improving what they're delivering, and where they really bought into using it to improve their programs.
I think the problem is that a lot of people just default to volume all the time. And, you know, like I said, I've spoken to a lot of clients where we've said, well, how do you measure your campaigns? You know, what are the metrics that you're using? What are the tools that you're using? And, you know, even for some of the big media evaluation companies, I've seen reports that they've produced for our clients where the whole emphasis is on volume. And, you know, as I said earlier, that really does give some very misleading results. And I think, you know, we've got to get beyond the point where we allow people, even if it is in the brief, to keep defaulting to volume all the time and to find something that is more meaningful in terms of the impact on the audience. It's what engages the audience and has an impact on audience behavior that is really, really important. And, you know, we need to start demanding that of our PR teams.
We talked about econometric. Sorry, go
on. Sorry, Karen. I was just going to say, what are those, you know, metrics beyond just tracking actions, output? What does that actually look like? What kind of data can you get back from that?
So what we're looking at Metricomm is the impact that PR has on the engaged audience. So instead of just counting the outputs, you know, the wrong metrics about the reach and the opportunities to see and the impressions and the volume of clippings and so on and so forth. What we've developed is a solution that allows us to calculate the probability for online media coverage that the audience will actually have not just seen it, but read it and engaged with it and been able to be prompted to take an action as a result of that. And I think those are the kinds of metrics that we're advocating. Like I say, it's not just about counting things that are easy to count. It's about really working out what does that mean in terms of behavioral impact.
Sorry, Marianne, I interrupted you there.
All right, don't worry. I don't know whether I interrupted you. It's the problem with Zoom, isn't it? You can't always tell. So all I was going to say was that I think we talked about econometric modeling a little bit earlier, and that's super expensive. It's really expensive. It's like sort of an entry fee of 50k. So if you already have that in the business, bolting onto your econometric modeling is brilliant and totally an option. But I think, you know, we're talking about improving measurement, and I think one of the big barriers can often be just cost and budget. And I just wanted to make it really clear that this doesn't have to be expensive. You can make huge improvements in your measurement, even if you are just counting outputs, simply by, you know, pivoting your reports so that they're really focused on objectives and you're putting those outputs against the objectives to start with. Because once you start on that journey towards better measurement and measurement that is aligned to your objectives and measurement that is used to improve your programs, what you find is that people will buy in quite quickly, and suddenly it's a no-brainer to spend, you know, a couple of £100 doing a quick pulse survey to add something to that, and then, you know, to maybe upgrade to a brand tracking or to, you know, do some of the work that Karen's talking about. You know, bolting those things on is much easier if you just make the first step on the journey. So it doesn't have to be that you are currently counting outputs and doing EAV and I'm sending you straight to econometric modeling. There's a journey to go along, and all steps are valid.
Karen, your work mentioned there a bit. Metricomm's algorithm obviously is kept under wraps to a degree, but what can you tell us about how it works, how you do the calculations at Metricomm?
Okay, thanks. So it works on a principle that's been very well understood by the SEO industry for a really long time, and that is that, you know, the content that is most visible is most likely to be opened and read. And so what our algorithm does is it looks at PR generated content, online media content, and it looks at where that actually appears in Google search results for a particular brand, company, product, or issue. And then it does a calculation based on, you know, we've created the algorithm based on a lot of academic research from Google, who obviously know a lot about search behavior, but also from some very reputable universities in the UK and elsewhere. And they've done a lot of analysis about how people interact with content that appears in search results. So we're using all of that information to calculate the probability, the likelihood that somebody who sees a piece of online news coverage will actually not just scroll past it, but open it, read it, and then take some kind of action as a consequence of that. And that may well be performing a Google search to find out more information about the brand or the product. We do a lot of work in the media industry. It might be something like watching a TV program because you've read a news article about it online and things like that. Now, the algorithm also takes into account the language that's used in the media content. And again, I think this is really interesting for PR professionals, because one of the things that you learn in PR school is that you need to keep everything fairly factual and fairly bland, and not use too many adjectives, not too much kind of superlative, and so on and so forth. But actually, recent research has shown that the language, if it is from an emotion point of view, very engaging, it's more likely to draw the reader in and to persuade them to read not just the headline, but to the end of the article. So we're taking things like that into consideration as well. So what we come up with is a calculation of what we call the engaged audience, which is very different from looking at things like the circulation figures of publications or looking at potential reach. What we're saying is it's a much smaller number, but we're using very complicated, sophisticated statistical methods to be able to say that it is highly, highly probable that this number of people saw that piece of content, read it, and then took another action and engaged with it as a consequence.
Okay, that's great stuff. And you've actually got research from Metricomm to show the measurement of an engaged audience. Before I bring these slides up, just we've got some questions in already from the audience, which is great. If anyone else wants to submit a question, we'll be getting to those about 15 minutes or so. So keep those coming in via the Q&A function. Karen, I'll hand over to you now and bring the slides up.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Alistair. So I just want to say, sort of by way of preamble, that we think this is really groundbreaking and something that is very, very exciting. The slides that I'm about to walk through are based on big data analysis, where we've been able to take tens of thousands of data points from a time period spanning from 2014 to 2021. Now, the wonderful thing about using Google search is that, data is available over a very long time period, and you can look historically, as well as looking at what's happening in the moment with your campaign that you're running right now. So we started looking at this because there was some research done by Les Binet, who is a very big authority in the advertising effectiveness space. And Les Binet did a presentation at FCOM 2020, where he was talking about share of Google search being a really strong predictor for market share in the car market and other markets like the mobile phone market. Now, we at Metricomm have used Google search for probably almost a decade because we think it's a really, really good proxy for sales. So what we wanted to do was to do a big data analysis to see if we could come up with similar results for the car market, showing that our engaged audience that we're calculating from online media coverage is also closely related. We wanted to see if we could show the same impact on search from online media coverage that Les Binet had shown from Google search. So what this chart is showing you is every dot represents a car brand for 1 year between 2014 and 2021. And you can see by the proximity of all of those dots to the regression line that there is a very, very strong statistical relationship between the size of the engaged audience that is created by online media coverage and search for these car brands. So you can see we've put labels on some of them, but each one should have a label. It gets a bit difficult to read if we put all of the labels on the chart. So you can see, for example, here that Ford generates more search than Porsche, but both of the brands generate really strong engaged audience from online media coverage. And exactly as Les Binet found in his analysis of share of search versus market share, we believe that the reason for this is price. And obviously, because Ford is a lower price brand, there will be more people naturally searching for that. Porsche, though, generates a lot of search from its online media coverage. The problem with Porsche is it's a very sort of attractive brand, but a lot of people will quickly find that they can't afford it, and then that will sort of automatically limit the share of search that you see overall in the market. So if I could have the next slide, please, Alistair.
Chris Whitty moment.
Absolutely. I've wanted to say that for the last year and a half. So what we've done on this chart is to remove the impact of price for both Ford and Porsche. And that allows you to see that the data fits much closer to the regression line. So the statistical correlation here that we're seeing between the size of the engaged audience and the share of search is so strong that it could not be down to chance alone. So our conclusion from this slide was that given there's a really clear relationship between engaged audience and search, we feel that there must also be a very clear relationship between the engaged audience that you get from online media coverage and advertising. And that's something that we'd really like to explore in more detail with the IPA and Les Binet and with marketing directors and others, because what this chart is suggesting to us is that day-to-day PR coverage in the car industry for all of these brands is amplifying the effect of advertising as well. Thanks, Alistair. So the ability to show a connection between the size of the engaged audience from online media coverage and search allows us to show that media coverage is actually having a demonstrable effect on the top of the sales funnel. So the next question for us was, does online media coverage continue to have a measurable link going through the funnel all the way to sales at the bottom? And this is what I was talking about earlier, being able to actually demonstrate that you are moving the needle on sales for a brand. Now, luckily for us, the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders publishes very granular information on sales data for individual car brands and models. So we were able to take all of that data over the period 2014 to 21 and map it onto the data that we had about the engaged audience. And once again, you can see that the chart, the picture is remarkably similar. So we are able to demonstrate that there is a measurable link that cannot be down to chance alone between the engaged audience, the people who read PR generated content, and the sales that are achieved for any given brand. Thanks, Alistair. So again, we've removed the impact of price, just to show what that relationship looks like. I don't need to talk in detail about this one because I talked about it previously, but if we could just go to the next one, I think this might be interesting for people because we've averaged the data for each brand over the whole 7-year period, which means that we've got rid of a lot of the dots. If you've all got dots in front of your eyes now, you can see now clearly which dot represents which brand. We've removed the clutter. So this chart also summarizes, I think, really nicely. You can see the white dots compared to the blue dots, that Vauxhall, Ford, Porsche and Jaguar search and sales are strongly influenced by price, and that echoes Les Binet's findings. However, I think there are a couple of interesting things that PR could note from this chart. The first one is that I think when the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal, the crisis broke, we probably all thought that that was, a really significant negative event for that brand. But what this is showing is that that negative PR, and there was an awful lot of it at the time around Dieselgate, didn't have too much of an impact on sales for Volkswagen. It didn't have too much of a long-term effect on the brand, which is great for them because they did the right thing at the time. They responded very proactively. The other thing that is interesting in this chart, I think, is that if you look at Mercedes, it achieved very, very similar levels of sales from a similar amount of media coverage to its rivals Audi and BMW, from a lower level of media coverage than its rivals Audi and BMW, although those cars retail at very similar price points. So often when we see these charts, we don't get all of the answers, but we start to ask more questions around them. And the question we would ask is, well, how has Mercedes managed to achieve that? How have they got a higher share of sales from less media coverage. And that might be down to things like, for example, the effectiveness of their advertising, or what Marianne was talking about earlier, you know, the sort of long-term residual reputation that they've been able to accumulate from their PR activity over time. One of the things that we think is very interesting, and there was a presentation by Kantar, I think, at the PR Moment Measurement Conference last week, which my colleague Mark watched. And Kantar were talking about this long-term effect of PR. I think what we're seeing in this analysis, and we're going to put out a paper on this as well within the next month or so, is that the impact of online media is increasingly short term. So I think in the print world and the broadcast world, it's probably a different story, but in a world where a lot of people are turning to online media, first and foremost, and particularly after the pandemic, I think we're going to see a much more immediate impact on, obviously, share of search, but also share of sales. So that will be really interesting to monitor over time. We've got some findings from brands like Galaxy, which we will be able to share very shortly. Thank you, Alistair.
No problem at all. And obviously there was a lot to go through there in a short space of time. There's the link to the Metricomm report in full, where all those graphs are, so you can spend some time digging into that data and reading a bit more about it. If you want, you can scan that with your camera now to get through to the link. And it will also be available on the write-up when that's done in about a week on prolificnorth.co.uk. I just want to go back there. There's a striking figure there that, you know, that 80% of the effectiveness comes from 20% of the media generated. Does that mean then, if you don't dig into this data and do this analysis, that actually the approach really should be to just keep ramping up coverage and keep ramping up coverage? Does that guarantee that the 20% might actually be enough to keep people happy, or is it a diminishing return?
Now, we're not saying that you shouldn't look at the whole 100%, but it is about really understanding where your results are coming from. There will always be a long tail of media, and, you know, there will be some people reading them. But the greatest impact, as I said, from all of the projects that I've worked on over recent years comes from sometimes less, you know, sometimes it's even 12 or 15% of the media. But it is about having the information that allows you to pinpoint those and to analyze those. You know, as PR people, the traditional way of operating was to have a media list, I think, Marianne, that was segmented. When I worked in-house, I used to have my tier 1 media, which was usually the nationals, and then my tier 2 media, which might have been some key regional titles, or some, you know, really top trade titles, and then my tier 3 media, which you would really just sort of publish things to, publish and pray, and hope that somebody might pick up your story. The thing is that it's not always the media that sit in tier 1 that actually produce the largest engaged audience. And what we see very often is that the data throws up surprises. So you might find that, you know, a title that you had in your tier 2 that you might not have put much emphasis on in your journalist outreach, you may not have even included them in the press release, you know, if you were thinking about tier 1 only. That actually can produce a very significant share of the engaged audience. And unless you know that, we were talking about planning and preparation and being able to tweak campaigns in flight so that you maximize your results. Unless you know, for example, that, you know, just out of the top of my head, the Birmingham Post generated a much higher proportion of the engaged audience for this story than might be suggested by its position in your media list or whatever, then you won't know that you've got to put emphasis and focus on that publication. And you won't understand the reasons why. You know, there can be some very good reasons why that is happening, but you need to drill down into the data to know whether, you know, that might be driven by a particular personality, a spokesperson, an influencer. It might just be driven by some local interest in the story. But having the right data really allows you to see the media mix is very different to what you think it might be.
I'd agree with that. I think the media list is evolving. You know, we used to build media lists based just on our target audiences, and also, as Karen says, a little bit of where you can definitely know you're going to get some coverage and get some stuff in the bank. But now we're not measuring on outputs, and it doesn't really matter if you've just got a big long list. You know, I'm not when I started, I was whacking down coverage books in receptions and that sort of stuff. Like, you don't need, the thickness of your coverage book isn't the important thing. So the media list is evolving, and it needs to be built based on target audience research, definitely, but also on knowing which media is doing which job for you. So like Karen says, online media, for example, there may be a set of titles that are particularly good at driving search for you. You may also want to be doing, you want to have some broadcast titles, because we know that broadcast titles will, and Karen and I were talking about this data the other day, where broadcast titles will give you a big spike in awareness and a big spike in activity and a big spike in search, but that will tail off quite quickly. And you might want to also have, some print, some podcasts, some influencers, all doing different jobs, all building your entire brand awareness and your brand understanding and your brand positioning. So your media list perhaps isn't going to be segmented by different audiences or different circulation figures, but it's going to be all targeted by what that media does for your brand.
So some of the media, for example, will be playing a much greater role in driving search. And again, you just have no way of knowing that unless you're drilling into the data. And it is very different for every campaign. And that's why it makes it really, really important to be able to access that data quickly and run the analysis and feed it into the team who are managing the activation, so that they can draw conclusions from it and do the things that they need to do to make a difference.
Now, just moving into sort of practical implementation now. My last question has actually been asked by a viewer far more eloquently, so I'll a question instead. Alyssa James asks, to both panelists, what would your advice be for getting the C-suite on board with measuring outcomes? I've encountered many senior people who ask about return on their comms investment, but this can be difficult to show when you're talking about behavioral change or brand awareness. So they often lean towards the Vanity Metrics as a benchmark. So a question now about buy-in, I suppose, from decision makers.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It is a real challenge. And sometimes you've got to be a bit pragmatic with your reporting. So, there might be a metric that the C-suite are super hung up on and they've always had it and they really like it. And, taking that away is potentially going to undermine your credibility. So you keep it in, but you add in some other stuff that, is perhaps more meaningful or more helpful, and try and ease them across to the other metrics. There are loads of calculations to use. Share of search is a really good one, actually, in terms of, and what Karen's talked about, econometric modeling is really great because then they're monetary values. Often the ones that are stickiest that I tend to see are financial businesses, so banks, and professional services. So lawyers like to have 90% for everything, and if it's less than 90%, it's not interesting. They're used to passing all their exams with distinction. So it's about understanding those particular nuances and making sure financial institutions, for example, like a financial value against their coverage. So it's about working out what's going to really excite people internally and then taking them on a journey, but certainly don't pull the rug out from under their feet and transition them straight to a perception thing. That's not going to work.
I mean, the reason why people are sitting in the C-suite is because they're there to drive the organization, and they are generally interested in business results. So I think my advice for anybody leading a PR team would be to be brave and, get hold of some data that actually gives a different perspective on the outcomes and the impact of the PR campaign. So for example, you could take in a chart, and remember that C-suite people have a very short attention span because they're very busy. So you can't take in a whole report that consists of 20 different charts. But if you could take in a chart that says, this is how our PR coverage has generated an engaged audience over the last 6 months. And this is how that corresponds to actual search for our brand and sales of our product, then I think you would get their attention. And similarly, if you took in a chart that showed them that, this coverage book that you've been looking at for the last 25 years or however long it is, you think that every piece of coverage in there has equal weight. But I can show you a chart that tells you that these 3 publications generated 80% of the engaged audience for that particular campaign. And so, think differently about the coverage book and the role of this volume of coverage and all of these different clippings in there. What we need to really focus on is what is delivering the results.
Okay, great stuff. There you go. So be confident, and maybe show them this webinar after it's recorded as well. Maybe that'll convince. Another question here. We've talked a lot about the coverage ending in sales and that being a way to kind of, I suppose, track and reverse engineer the effectiveness of PR. But another question here says, do the panelists have any advice for non-commercial, non-sales driven organizations which are trying to prove the impact of their communications and engagement on the organization's objectives?
Yeah, so when it comes to AMEC, and by the way, AMEC have a great not-for-profit group which is really active in sharing best practice amongst each other, so it's worth checking that out and seeing if you can get involved. But when it comes to AMEC, they very much say to start with whatever your organizational objective is. So that would be the thing that is in your annual report or is on your website in the About Us section. What is the reason for that organization? And what are you looking to achieve? What's your mission statement? And then making sure that your comms objectives are linked to that. So if you are gathering donations or raising awareness of a particular issue affecting people, then obviously your comms objective should be linked to that. And that is the thing that I would say you need to focus on measuring. So look at your big organizational goal, make sure your comms objective aligns to it, and then measure against that objective really closely. And you'll still be able to demonstrate value, even though it's not sales-based.
I think one of the things that can be really helpful here is benchmarking against other organizations in your sector. So some of the work that we've done in the past looks at, maybe 10 or 15 or 20 organizations. You could do that really easily in the non-profit sector. And again, I would be looking to find correlations, relationships between the PR activity and what people are searching for, whether people are actually engaging with the issues and how that compares to other similar organizations. So, for example, we did a lot of work during the coronavirus pandemic, which helped organizations to understand not whether people were searching for coronavirus or not, but what specifically was it related to coronavirus. So there were a lot of people who had concerns about coronavirus and, not just the immediate health impacts, but things like pregnancy and stuff like that. And again, if you're a charity, if you're a non-profit organization, the granular detail about what people are searching for, not just your brand or your topic, but the related topics and the related brands, can really help you to understand whether you're doing a good job compared to other people who are interested in the same field.
Great stuff, thank you. Another question here, another anonymous attendee. What would you say to those who are still offering AVE and EVE as the metric to clients? I would add to that if we could explain what AVE and EVE are as well.
Yeah, no worries. So AVE is advertising value equivalent. EAV is equivalent value advertising value. I can't remember what the way around the letters are. Anyway, it's basically when you say this space in this media coverage that we've secured would be worth this amount if we bought it as advertising. And that's that old school metric that I talked about right at the start, measuring with the ruler. So it's been widely outed as not being a great metric to use because it's largely made up, because nobody pays rate card anyway for their advertising. So it's obviously not accepted in the industry, but there are loads of people using it because, like I say, it's a monetary value and it's something that has been used for years and years and years. So people do still get attached to it. You do occasionally get clients that are really reticent to leave it behind, and I completely understand that if you've always measured that way, it is it's a difficult thing to then remove. So I would say if people are really reticent, is to keep the metric but add others in and start to make it smaller on your report and make it less prominent and dial up the focus on other things, and also to just find some of another metric that is a monetary metric sometimes really helps, because or understanding why that EAV has become such a thing. So often it is because it's a monetary value, but there might be another reason within your organization that EAB's really sort of desired or people are asking for it. And it's understanding the reason behind that so that you can find the right metric to replace it with. And it comes back to that sort of no one size fits all. It's all about understanding. It's just like any other aspect of PR. It's about understanding what your audience wants and making sure that you're sort of delivering that while keeping an eye on best practice. I also deliver a lot of best practice measurement training, and I think talking about what EAB is and how it's calculated sometimes will demystify it, and people drop it pretty quickly once they understand, oh right, okay, yeah, no, we're not going to use that anymore then. So yeah, bit of education and a bit of adding in something else slowly.
I mean, it was my understanding that AVEs were supposed to be outlawed pretty much by the media evaluation industry. And I know AMEC has supported that position. And it is massively frustrating for people like Marianne and for me, where, you know, you do see a brief or you look at the evaluation that somebody's done and their front and center is the AVE number before anything else. You know, I would encourage people to look for alternatives. We have an alternative, which is a financial metric. I won't go into detail now, but again, it's based on the algorithm and the, you know, the value of the coverage, the PR coverage that you're getting in a particular place in the Google search results. That does have an open market value that can be calculated. And we do use that for some of our clients. But, you know, I think any self-respecting PR person wants to do the best job for their organization. And if they understand why AVEs are a bad thing, because they're just not relevant in an age where everybody's reading their media online, you know, pretty much everything that appears in print appears also online, and you can measure it, and you can also measure the financial value of it. So why wouldn't you want to do that? And I think we've just got to be braver and bolder and put forward these alternatives and explain why they are more fit for purpose in the digital age.
And I think we've got time for one more from Amy Stone. What is the best way to measure the success and value of broadcast coverage? I'm sure that's one we could do a whole webinar on, but I'll put that to both of you.
Do you want to start, Karen?
We treat broadcast in exactly the same way. So for some of our clients, we take broadcast coverage and calculate the size of the engaged audience. It's really interesting, as Marianne alluded to earlier. So we see that the impact of broadcast is often much shorter lived than the impact of online media coverage. But there's no reason why you can't treat it in exactly the same way from our perspective and from our tools point of view.
We do the same. We treat it exactly the same as any other piece of coverage. I think what is interesting is to understand the role that broadcast plays for your brand. So, for example, broadcast often has a larger audience. You get a bigger from a single piece of coverage. You would get a larger audience than you might from a print or an online piece, often, not always. So it can have a disproportionate effect if you're just measuring something like opportunities to see, where you're just counting, reach or circulation. Then it can have a disproportionate effect. So understanding what that effect then has on your actual brand is really important to understand then how you use it in your mix and how you use it for your particular purposes.
I just want to squeeze in one question really quickly, if I can, before we run out of time. A question on email. How much of a solution is new technology versus having people with expertise to unpack the data? Surely it's not enough to simply have more data. I know that we don't have much time left, and it's a fairly big question, but if I could just get a really quick answer from you both.
Okay, the quick answer. So go on, Karen, you go first.
It's a massive question. And for us, the answer is we use both. And, you know, we don't believe in black boxes where you shove data in one end and get answers out of the other. We use computers for the things that computers are really good at, which is doing the heavy lifting and the really complicated data crunching. But we always put human eyes on it. We always challenge the outputs, ask questions about why things are happening, look for the underlying reasons. So it is very much a combination of the two. What the technology allows us to do, though, as you saw with the charts that I presented earlier, is to quickly reach conclusions about much bigger volumes of data than we would ever have been able to process in a short period of time in the past.
I'd completely agree. I'd be really nervous about anybody who used just computers or just one data source for their measurement. You've got to have a human because that's where you get the really interesting and useful insights out.
And they're really good at holding rulers as well, which is
great at holding rulers.
Rulers are banned in our
thank you. Thank you, Karen and Marianne, and everyone watching live today. A write-up of the highlights of this webinar will be available on prolificnorth.co.uk. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can find a link to those highlights below. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.